Hey guys, welcome to this week's small group. Now, what I want us to start out with, I want you to imagine that you were driving a boat in the middle of the night. You had two friends on the boat with you, and then all of a sudden the GPS goes out. You've got to figure out how you're going to get back. You got one friend that says, hey, don't worry, I can navigate our way back by the stars. And they start pointing out certain stars to you, and they show you that they really, truly do know how to navigate via the stars. But then you've got your other friend who says, no, don't listen to them. I've got an internal compass. Like, I know which way to go. So one friend's telling you go one way, the other friend's telling you go the other way. Which one are you going to listen to? I don't know about you, but I would probably listen to the person that can navigate with the stars. You know what's funny is that you may never be put in that situation, but you could possibly be put in a myriad of other situations where you're going to have some wisdom. So the question is are you going to rely on your internal compass, or are you going to rely on the wisdom of God? Questions like, should I lie for my boss? Should I marry this person? Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? And we need to be able to have answers to those questions. So to start off this small group, I want you to ask the questions, what characteristics describe a wise person? And what are the consequences of being unskilled when it comes to wisdom? Today we're going to be analyzing 4 different types of wisdom literature. Now, where we left off our small groups before the summer is we were talking about King Solomon. He was considered to be the wisest king to ever rule on the face of the planet. And what's great is that we don't just have the story of him, we also have some of his writings. And 3 of the 4 different wisdom literatures that we find in Scripture are actually written by him, or at least people believe it was written by him. So what we're going to start off with is we're going to read Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, and Proverbs chapter 9, verse 11. And as you read these verses, I want you to be thinking of an answer to this question. What comes to mind when you think of the fear of the Lord? And is this the same as being afraid of God? Make sure you explain your answer to your small group. Before we go on, I want to make sure that you understand a few things about fearing God. Fearing God doesn't mean that he's some sort of hard taskmaster. Fearing God is accepting him as the creator of right and wrong. Fearing God keeps us focused on the good that he has planned for us. It's kind of like with my father. I feared disappointing my father. I feared his discipline. I didn't want to experience my father's discipline. But that doesn't mean that my father didn't love me. It's not that I knew that my dad loved me. And it was because he was willing to discipline me that I knew that he loved me. According to Proverbs 1, what is the difference between the wise and the foolish? Hopefully you came to the conclusion that the wise are the ones who fear God, and the foolish are the ones who do not fear God. The wise are the ones who depend on God for right and wrong, but the foolish are the ones who rely on an internal compass for right and wrong. For this next section, I want you to read from the Song of Solomon. That's the love book in the Bible. Read verses chapter 2, verse 7. Read the verse in chapter 3, verse 5, chapter 8, verse 4. And what you're going to notice is within those 3 verses, there's actually, it says the same thing throughout the Song of Psalms. And then I also want you to read chapter 6, verse 3. And after you read all of these, I want you to answer these questions. Is passion wrong? And what do these scriptures say about passion? And under what circumstances can love be foolish or wrong. Hopefully you noticed in those verses that throughout the Song of Solomon, it's reminding us, do not allow passion to take over at the inappropriate time. You see, God is not against passion. He created our capacity for passion. God warns us against undirected passion because it's dangerous. But directed passion is godly and fruitful. Let's go back to that boat analogy. Imagine you had a boat and you had a way to go, like you had a motor that would make you go in a direction, but you didn't have a way to steer that. You see, passion is like the propulsion. It's like the wind or the motor that gets you moving. But wisdom is the rudder. Wisdom is the steering wheel that turns the motor. It's what allows you to steer and have direction. And you see, wisdom comes from being able to not only have passion, but also to control it. Unfortunately, our culture today, they love to have uncontrolled passion. Now, moving away from the Song of Solomon and into the books of Job and Ecclesiastes, what you're going to find is that, the book of Proverbs, it gives you all of these tips for life, and if you do this, you'll get this. It's like cause and effect. But the book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes says, you know what? Sometimes it doesn't work out the way that we plan. In the story of Job, the Bible describes him as this righteous man, but yet God allows these horrible things to happen to him. Job does all the right things that we find in Proverbs, but it seems like he's getting punished for them. And then the author of Ecclesiastes says that life is meaningless. In fact, he says, meaningless, 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 everything is meaningless. So what I want you to do is read Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, and ask the question, how do we resolve the tension between the moral principles of Proverbs and the hard realities of Job and Ecclesiastes? If you didn't come to an answer or conclusion as a small group, don't feel bad. It's a really confusing thing. In fact, there's a famous author, Christian author, that says, if Proverbs gives us the broad terms of the contract, Job and Ecclesiastes gives us the fine print. And sometimes the fine print seems to void the heart of the entire document. It's written by Charles Drew. And while it may seem on the surface to contradict Proverbs, we need to understand it doesn't void what is being said in Proverbs. It actually helps us find wisdom when nothing else seems to make sense. I want you to read Job chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. Ask you the question, have you ever witnessed a tragedy that made someone lose his or her faith in God? And what makes a person strengthen their faith during a tragedy rather than lose their faith? One of the things that I want you to notice is that if all we had was the book of Proverbs, we would lose our faith in God when bad things happen to good people. See, if all we had was the book of Proverbs, then we would lose our faith all the time. But luckily for us, God has provided the book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes to help us have a deeper theology that can handle the troubles of life. Job ends up questioning God at the end of the book of Job, and he demands an answer from God. And what's interesting is that God shows up in this violent storm. He says, you question me? He says, well, I'll tell you what, let me question you. And in Job 38, God says to Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? And he goes on for several chapters just talking about all of the things that he has done in his great majesty. And at the end, Job goes, you know what, God? I'm not going to say anything. You're right. And at the end of Job, he comes to the conclusion that he needs to fear God. Even when things don't seem to work out the way that he wanted it to, he ends up fearing God. What I want you to do is read Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 through 14. And according to these passages that you read today, all of them, what does wisdom begin and end with? And is this concept offensive to you? Why or why not? Hopefully you came to the conclusion that wisdom begins and ends with the fear of God. But how does this relate to Jesus? We've been talking, and this whole study has been about how all of the Old Testament and the New Testament all point to Jesus. How does the wisdom literature point to Jesus? Well, what I want you to do is read 1 Corinthians 1, verses 22 through 25. And according to these passages, what is the power and the wisdom of God? According to these passages, Jesus is the ultimate wisdom of God. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, and the beginning of the gospel is the fear of God. You notice how every week when I start sharing the gospel, we always start with, well, God is perfect and God is holy. But we're not perfect and holy. And we've offended the very nature of God. Man, the gospel begins with the fear of God. And Jesus is the wisdom. I want you to share one specific way that the fear of God could change your life this week. Maybe it'll change the way you talk. Maybe it'll change the way that you react to your kids or your spouse, your employers, your employees. And then I want you to close in prayer, asking God to help you make those changes in your life. Guys, I want you to have a great rest of the week. Use wisdom, and I'll see you on Sunday.